On June 12, 1990, Algerian President Chadli Bendjedid from the National Liberation Front, a nationalist group and a political party in Algeria, had predicted resounding victory against the Islamic Salvation Front, an Islamist political party in Algeria headed by Abassi, Madani, and Ali Belhadj. However, after the victory by the FIS, members of the government refused to step down, leading the country into an 11-year civil war. Islamist parties and groups started popping up, and threats were made to the French residents and to foreign nationals. Airports were put on high alert. Intelligence reports coming in from Algeria and France that members of the group are targeting airliners with Stinger missiles, as well as a threat of hijackings. On December 24th, 1990, at Houari Boumediene Airport in Algeria, 4 men boarded Air France Flight 8989, which was due to depart for Only Airport in Marseille, France at 11:15. The men were dressed as Algerian presidential police. They wore blue uniforms with Air Algiers logos. Their presence originally did not cause any alarm. 2 of the men began inspecting the passengers' passports, while 1 went into the cockpit, and the 4th stood guard. Claude Bunegard, a flight attendant, recalled noticing that the police were armed, and one of them had dynamite showing, which she considered to be unusual, as the Algerian police were not normally armed when carrying out checks. The Algerian military felt suspicious on noting that the Air France flight appeared to have an unauthorized delay, so they began surrounding the aircraft. Zahida Kaachi, a passenger, recalled seeing members of the Special Intervention Group, the GIS, known as ninjas, outside the aircraft. Kakachi recalled hearing one of the police say, "Tahagit," an Arabic word for tyrant, upon seeing the GIS men gathering outside the A300 bus. She then realized that the 4 men on board the plane were terrorists. The 4 hijackers immediately revealed that they were not police, but mujahideen seeking to establish an Islamic State in Algeria. They had hijacked the aircraft because the national airline Air France was a symbol of France, which they viewed as infidel foreign invaders. Most of the 227 passengers had settled into their seats in an almost festive mood as they looked forward to joining family and friends for the holidays. The hijackers immediately closed and locked the doors. One of them shouted, "Allah is great," in which one of the passengers stated, "I knew it was a hostage taking when they shouted, 'Allah is great.' I thought of my children back in France, and so I became afraid." 3 men then entered the cockpit. The 4th covered us with a Kalashnikov. No one budged. Then the waiting started. For 2 of the travelers, the wait was over all too soon. One traveler, an Algerian policeman identified during the passport check, was ordered by the hijackers to the front of the plane. Passengers heard him plead, "Don't kill me. I have a wife and child." The terrorists shot him in the head and dumped him outside into a baggage cart, where he lay in agony for some time. The second victim was Bui Giang To, a commercial attaché at the Vietnamese embassy in Algiers. They asked the Vietnamese man sitting in the rear to come forward. The poor guy, one passenger recalled, "We saw him come back to get his leather jacket. Then we heard the shot." According to several passengers' accounts, the hijackers appeared to be in their early 20s. They were beardless and had closely cropped hair. They were almost correctly polite, said one woman, but they had the determined air of cold-blooded killers. Said another passenger, they seemed excited, very euphoric. They told us they would give us a lesson to the French and to the world, that they would slow and show what they were capable of. The hijackers made certain everyone got the point by brandishing Kalashnikovs, assault rifles, Uzi pistols, and homemade hand grenades, while carrying 2 packs of dynamite. Later, they placed one 10-stick pack of dynamite in the cockpit and a second under a seat in the middle of the plane and linked them with a detonator wire. One of the terrorists' first concerns was to see that all the women, including the stewardesses, were veiled in the fundamentalist Islamic fashion. Those who had no scars were given cabin blankets. The men recited verses from the Quran and tried to reassure their Algerian compatriots. But in the words of one passenger, terrorized non-Algerians, they had a kind of art in their terror. 20 minutes of relaxation and 20 minutes of torture. You never knew what was next. One of the hijackers was Abdullah Yahahi, who said, Allah has chosen us to die, and Allah has chosen you to die with us. Allah guarantees our success, inshallah. Yahahi went over to the cockpit audio and recited, we are the soldiers of mercy. Allah has selected us as the soldiers. We are here to wage war in his name. At noon, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alain Juppe, organized a crisis team, and Charles Pasqua, the Interior Minister of France, met his aides. French Prime Minister Hilaire Baldufer was recalled from his Christmas holiday in Chaumont in France, and other government officials were also summoned from their vacations. Baldufer recalled and recollected spending the entire afternoon on the telephone, trying to determine what was happening and feeling confused. According to Baldufer, the Algerian authorities wanted to crack down on the terrorists, and Baldufer himself encountered difficulties discussing the events. At one point, the hijackers dropped the demand for the release of Abassi and Belhadj, the FIS party leaders. 2 hours into the hijacking, the men told the captain to depart for France so that they could hold a press conference there. The captain could not take off because the aircraft boarding stairs were still attached to the plane, and the Algerian authorities were blocking the runway with parked vehicles. When the hijackers forced the captain to ask for the boarding stairs to be removed, the Algerian authorities refused, determined not to give in to any of the hijackers' demands. The men announced that they would detonate the aircraft unless the Algerian authorities followed their orders. During the night, Spanish authorities allowed the French military to send its forces to Madani, Spain, which was as close to Algeria as was possible without being accused of interfering in the situation. 7 hours into the hijacking, the captain was calm but tense. The pilots now attempted to defuse the situation by talking to the hijackers and trying to gain their trust. Delhomme explained that the beginning of the hijacking is violent, so the role of the pilot is to keep the participants calm and buy time. At 8 o'clock, Groupe d'Intervention National, the GIGN, boarded an Airbus 4A300 aircraft similar to the hijacked plane at a military base in France. En route to Majorca, the GIGN operatives were able to familiarize themselves with the A300 in preparation for storming the aircraft. After the GIGN's plane arrived at Palma de Mallorca Airport, the Algerian government made it clear that the French forces were not welcome in Algeria. On December 25th, Captain Delhomme made a tour of the cabin at about 2 a.m. the next morning to check on the situation. He said that the cabin was calm during the time. He noticed that 2 of the hijackers were asleep on the floor. In the morning, French Prime Minister Edouard Beldur flew to Paris. New information arrived at the Consulate General of France in Oran, Algeria, via a mole in the GIA. From French Minister Interior Charles Pacour, quote, "We received this information directly from members of the Algerian Secret Service, and this information was very worrying. The terrorist's true aim was not to force the release of Belhadj and Madani, but to crash the plane in Paris." End quote. Police confirmed this plan after a raid on a GIA safe house. The hijackers began to release some of the passengers, mainly women with young children and those with severe medical conditions. Over 170 people still remained on board the plane. The hijackers offered to release the remaining Algerian passengers, but the Algerians refused to leave the aircraft. Delhomme recalled that one passenger who was refusing to leave said that he thought the crew would be killed if he did, and Delhomme believed that the passengers' motives were sincere. By the end of December 25th, the hijackers had freed a total of 63 passengers. The Algerian police used night vision devices to identify the lead hijacker, Abdullah Yahani. The French government sent Yahya's mother to plead for him to release the passengers in the hope that she could persuade her son to give in. But the tactic backfired. One passenger, Kakachi, recalled Yahya becoming enraged by this move. At this point, the hijackers began targeting the French passengers. There were two staff members of the French embassy in Algeria on board the flight, a secretary and a chef. The hijackers forced the chef, Yannick Benouget, to plead into the microphone. Through Benouget, they demanded that unless the Algerian government cleared the A300 for takeoff before 9:30 p.m., they would kill one passenger every 30 minutes, starting with Benouget. The Algerian passengers assured him that the hijackers were bluffing, while the French passengers were demanding that the aircraft be allowed to take off. When the 9:30 p.m. deadline passed, the hijackers shot the chef and threw his body outside. The door opened, and the warning light came on in the cockpit, indicating to the pilots that another passenger had been murdered. Enraged, Captain Delhomme yelled at the Algerian authorities, "See what you get when you play tough." The French government were informed of the events. Baldour spoke on the telephone to Prime Minister of Algeria, Makdad Sifi. He told him that the French government would hold the Algerian government responsible for the outcome if it did not authorize them to intervene in the situation. There was insufficient fuel on board the plane to reach Paris because the auxiliary power unit had been running since the hijackers took the plane. So, a refueling stop was scheduled at Marseille Province Airport. Delhomme confronted Yahahi to find out whether he planned to blow up the aircraft between Algiers and Marseille. Yahahi insisted that the plane would fly to Marseille, take on fuel, then fly to Paris for the press release. Delhomme prepared for takeoff. In an interview, Delhomme suggested that the hijackers would probably have said this anyway to prevent the crew from taking action against them. Boumediene recalled that the hijackers in the cockpit seemed excited, like kids. On December 26th, Air France 8989 approached Marseille during the early hours. The hijackers did not know that Major Denis Favier of the Gigan squad was already in Marseille, having flown from Majorca to a military base near Marseille and planned to storm the aircraft while it was landing there. The GIGN squad practiced entering the A300 before Flight 8989 arrived in Marseille. Favier explained in an interview that the enemy was arriving in friendly territory and the power difference would be a key element in the struggle. The plane landed at 3:33 a.m. At around 8 a.m., the hijackers demanded that the forces let the aircraft take off by 9:40 a.m. The negotiators delayed the ultimatum by giving the aircraft additional food and water, emptying the toilet tanks and providing vacuum cleaners. The GIGN operatives servicing the aircraft were disguised as airport personnel. They discovered the aircraft doors were not blocked or booby-trapped. The men planted eavesdropping devices while others trained long-term Canon microphones on the A300 fuselage and windows. Favier's group asked the hijackers if they would rather do a press conference in Marseille instead of Paris, since all the major media outlets had offices in Marseille. The hijackers agreed to hold the press conference on the A300. The negotiators requested that the front of the aircraft be cleared for the press conference. This was to create an aura for the GIGN and an area to storm the aircraft. Favier explained in an interview that the press conference was an important tactic as it allowed the passengers to be moved to the rear of the aircraft. The hijackers did not realize that the doors of the A300 bus could be opened from the outside. By 5 p.m., the authorities had not delivered any amount of fuel to the A300. Yahahi entered the cabin to choose a fourth person to kill. He selected the youngest member of the Air France crew, who told the hijackers that he was an atheist. Yahi felt reluctant to kill a fourth passenger at that point, saying, "I don't want to do this, but I have no choice." Bernard stated in an interview that he did not know whether Yahi had decided not to execute the crew member. She knew that he kept delaying the execution. Instead, the hijackers opened the door and fired around the aircraft. Zahedi Kakachi, a passenger, recalled that the hijackers began reciting verses from the Quran on the public address system. The verses were prayers for the dead. The hijackers noticed the boarding stairs moving toward them. They recognized the imminent assault. Through the cockpit window, a hijacker fired upon the stairs containing the forward GIGN team. As the stairs reached the front starboard right door, it became apparent that it was elevated too high relative to the door frame for a uniform entry into the aircraft. The GIGN had trained on an empty aircraft in which the suspension system of the plane was not as compressed. One hijacker was instantly killed. Then the two other units entered the rear of the aircraft. The participants fired hundreds of bullets. The hijackers fired through the skin of the aircraft. Grenades erupted and smoke went through the cabin. The GIGN's concussion grenades temporarily blinded and deafened occupants, allowing the GIGN team to storm the aircraft. One of the hijackers' homemade grenades detonated, causing limited damage. The snipers on the tower could not initially get a clear shot into the aircraft as the co-pilot, Jean-Paul Boumediene, blocked their view. Moments later, Boumediene pulled himself out of the cockpit window and dropped to the ground. With the view unobstructed, the snipers began firing into the cockpit, while the GIGN team evacuated passengers in the rear of the aircraft. Flight attendant Claude Bernard described the firefight as the apocalypse. Christopher Morin, a flight attendant, recalled that the GIGN onboard passengers and crew to get down as low as possible with their hands over their heads, and then not to move. Morin described the situation as violent and recalled putting his overcoat over his head so he would not see the trace of bullets and other occurrences during the raid. Pilot Bernard Delham said that he was in a rather bad spot, so he crouched and made himself as small as possible. A few minutes after the beginning of the assault, most of the passengers had escaped. At that point, 3 of the 4 hijackers were fatally shot. Delham recalled that the cockpit only had himself, the flight engineer, and the last hijacker. Delham said that the hijacker could have killed him and his colleagues out of spite, but did not. In an interview, Dennis Favier explained that there likely was a mutual recognition and respect between the hijackers and the hostages. He believes the bombs between the hijackers and hostages helped save lives of passengers and crew in the conflict. At 5:35 p.m., Favier radioed to the tower that the incident was over. The incident had unfolded over 54 hours, in which all of the hijackers had been killed. The remaining passengers and crew survived the 20-minute gun battle. Of the remaining passengers, 13 received minor injuries. 9 of the 30 GI Jin operatives received injuries. 1 received serious wounds. 3 crew members received injuries. Delhomme was hit by bullets in his right elbow and thigh. Boussat received minor injuries. The dead bodies of the 2 hijackers had shielded Delhomme and Boussat from gunfire. Boudier, the most seriously injured, fractured his elbow and thigh from the 5-meter drop. Favier said that it determined that the operation was a success since none of the GIGN received fatal injuries. French Prime Minister Edouard Balladur said the events unfolded exceptionally well. According to a former militant group leader of the FIS, he admitted that the men had planned to detonate the aircraft over the Eiffel Tower. The militant group never again attempted this plot. Pasqua said that if the militants crashed the aircraft on the Eiffel Tower, they would have committed what would they believe to be an extraordinary feat. Most of the passengers and crew were Algerians. 138 of the passengers were Algerian citizens. Hijackers Abdullah Yahahi, also known as the Emir, was a petty thief and a greengrocer from the Bab el Ghaid neighborhood of Algeria. The negotiators said that Yahahi spoke approximate French and always ended his sentences in Inshallah, which means God willing. As the hijacking progressed, the passengers recognized the personalities of the hijackers. Claude Bernegard, a flight attendant, recalled that the crew and passengers gave nicknames to the hijackers to make things similar and simpler. According to Bernegard, one of the hijackers was named Lofty and said that the hijacker named Lofty insisted that the passengers follow Islamic law. He also found women having their heads uncovered intolerable, making him angry. One hijacker did not give his name to the passengers, so Bernegard called him Bill. Bill was a little bit simple and more of a goat herd than a terrorist. She said his role as a hijacker was an error in casting. One of the hijackers was named the killer, the one who shot the hostages whom the hijackers had targeted. Immediately after the event, members of the Algerian government began instituting members of the intelligence services to institute as terrorists inside the group of the FIS. Some FIS members began to complain that some of their own members became even more fervent and more violent than the members of the group, leading many massacres in the war-torn country of Algeria. When it was over, many people who survived the incident thanked members of the GIGN and the French government for saving their lives. However, what is often forgotten by many was the agenda of the hijackers themselves, wanting to crash a plane into the Eiffel Tower. This is the first known instance of Islamic radical fundamentalist group of wanting to crash a plane intentionally into a sensitive target. Was this the precursor of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks? Was this the precursor to the Bajinka plot, which gave the idea to Abdul Hakim Arad, who then gave his ideas to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who then gave his ideas to Osama bin Laden? We'll never know for sure. But one thing is for certain. Air France Flight 8989 was the beginning of a terrible trend.